What happens when your heart's purest desire is treated like dust beneath a rich man's boot? When the only person who can help you is the one you've pushed away? Can true courage ever truly conquer the cruelty of pride? In a village nestled between the quiet, rolling hills of the savannah, two lives were once separated by an invisible, yet unforgiving, fence. The young man who lived in the shadow of the great mahogany tree carried a secret burden, a choice he never thought he would have to make. She made her decision long ago, cementing the divide. But now, the silence has broken. The wind carries a desperate cry, and everything is at stake. This isn't just a story about unrequited love. It's a story about the distance between the easy path of bitterness and the impossible leap of selfless grace. Before his name became the whisper of legends, there was Kofi. A boy with nothing but his two strong hands and a heart too big for his own good. Welcome to Stories by the King, where every story carries a heartbeat, and every truth demands to be heard. Now, before we begin, where in the world are you watching from? Is it morning in Lagos, evening in Nairobi, or midnight in London? Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now, lean in. Because this isn't just about what happened, it's about what it means. The sun beat down on the village of Kufina, but its warmth did not reach Kofi's heart. He sat mending fishing nets by the riverbank, his lean frame hardened by endless work, his eyes fixed on the grand estate that crowned the nearest hill. That estate belonged to Chief Ekintala, and within its walls lived the object of Kofi's devotion and the source of his deepest wound, Adesuwa. She was a girl of breathtaking elegance, whose laughter sounded like the gentle chime of 1,000 brass bells, but whose words were as sharp as broken glass when they were aimed at him. Kofi was poor, a fisherman's son, with no inheritance but the river itself. Adesuwa was the chief's daughter, destined for a life of comfort and a marriage to a man who could match her father's influence, a man whose pockets were lined with enough gold to make the village elders nod in approval. He remembered her words from the market square, spoken for all to hear: "Kofi, you are a good man, but a dream cannot be built on the water that flows away. My husband must be solid ground." Kofi had swallowed the rejection whole, letting the shame burn him from the inside out, yet he never stopped watching. It was not a stalker's gaze, but a desperate yearning for a happiness that was not meant for him. He watched her from afar as she danced at festivals, her movements fluid and free, and he felt a bittersweet ache. The entire village knew of his silent worship, and they pitied him, not for his poverty, but for his misplaced heart. He was a good son, always sharing his meager catch, helping the elderly with their thatched roofs, and his kindness was the quiet song of the village. Adesuwa, however, saw only the torn clothes and the smell of fish. She saw the future her father had painted for her, a tapestry woven with silk and titles, and Kofi was a coarse thread that had no place in it. The moral flaw in their world was this: worth was measured by what you owned, not by who you were. One late afternoon, a shadow fell over the village that was not the shadow of the setting sun. It was the rumor of a threat from the dense, uncharted forest that lay beyond the farmlands, a place whispered to be the dwelling of a banished, vengeful spirit. The village elders dismissed it as old women's tales, but Chief Ekintala, always one to believe his wealth could shield him from any evil, became suddenly obsessed with protection. He hired armed men from the city, strangers with cold eyes and brutal methods, and soon the grand estate became a fortress of stone and paranoia. Adesuwa, once so lively and visible, was confined. Kofi saw her less and less, and when he did, the light in her eyes seemed dimmer, replaced by a fear that no amount of gold could quell. The chief's wealth, once her shield, was now her gilded cage. The tension in the air was thick, like the humid air before a storm. Kofi knew the forest better than anyone. He often ventured deep inside for special medicinal herbs his aging mother required. He knew its paths, its noises, its rhythms. He felt the unrest that settled over the ancient trees. It was not a vengeful spirit, but something far more human and dangerous, something drawn by the scent of the chief's vast, unsecured fortune. Kofi tried to warn the elders, describing the faint trails he'd found, footprints of heavy boots, not the delicate tracks of game, but he was shooed away. The poor boy sees ghosts because he has no cows to count, the chief steward had sneered. Adesuwa was within earshot and did nothing to defend him, simply turning away with a shrug that felt like a fresh rejection. That night, the forest finally spoke. The sounds were not the gentle rustling of leaves but the sharp, shocking crack of splintered wood and a single, desperate, terrified scream. Kofi was already awake, perched by the river, his fishing spear clutched in his hand. He recognized the sound immediately. The back gate of the chief's estate, the one facing the forest, had been breached. And that scream, sharp, high, and cut short, could only have come from one person. It was Adesuwa. Kofi felt the familiar sting of rejection clash violently with a sudden, surging, instinctual need to act. He had no plan, no weapon but his spear, and every reason in the world to stay hidden, safe in his poverty. But as the dark silence rushed in to swallow the scream, Kofi did not hesitate. He stood up, cast the fishing spear aside, and ran toward the sound, toward the estate, toward the only girl who had ever truly mattered. His shadow, tall and determined, moved like a streak of lightning against the dark horizon, heading directly into the jaws of a danger he could not possibly overcome alone. He was running toward the girl who had rejected him, and the great forest was waiting to welcome him. The chief's estate was a scene of calculated chaos. The hired city guards, caught off guard by the silent, professional attack, were scattered and subdued. Kofi slipped past the main gate, using the shadows and the knowledge of the terrain he had gained since childhood. He saw the attackers, not spirits, but hardened men dressed in black, moving with the efficiency of trained mercenaries. They were after the chief's vault, but in the frenzy, one of the men, a giant of a fellow with a scar that twisted his face into a permanent snarl, had snatched the chief's daughter as a high-value hostage. Adesuwa was bound, a piece of silk gagging her mouth, but her eyes, wide with a terror Kofi had never seen, were fixed on him from across the courtyard. It was a brief, impossible connection, the rich daughter and the poor fisherman, both frozen in a shared, deadly instant. In that moment, she didn't see the torn clothes, she saw the only pair of familiar eyes in a world gone mad. The giant dragged Adesuwa toward the edge of the property, aiming for the dense anonymity of the forest, the same path Kofi was intimately familiar with. Kofi knew he could not confront the man head-on. The mercenary was armed with a gleaming machete that looked too heavy for a regular man to wield. Instead, Kofi let his deep knowledge of the land take over. He circled wide, darting into the chief's expansive, overgrown fruit orchard, his movements silent and fast like a hunting cat. He was no soldier, but he was a survivor. His advantage was the enemy's arrogance. They thought they were in control, believing the poor boy had run in fear with the rest of the villagers. Kofi, meanwhile, was utilizing the very skills Adesuwa had scorned, the ability to move through the wild, to track, to remain unseen, to value life over gold. He reached the forest line ahead of the captor and his captive. The forest floor was uneven, littered with tangled roots and sharp rocks, a nightmare for anyone rushing. Kofi found the one thing he knew could slow a man down, a hidden, deep trench, dug long ago by a flash flood, that lay across the mercenaries' likely path. He could not move the trench, but he could disguise it. Walking with furious speed, his heart pounding a rhythm of pure adrenaline, he scattered dead leaves and broke branches over the chasm, creating a convincing, but fragile, surface. He had only seconds to spare before the heavy footsteps of the mercenary and the muffled cries of Adesuwa reached the edge of the trap. He flattened himself behind the roots of an immense baobab tree, invisible in the deep gloom. As they approached, the giant, focused only on getting Adesuwa deeper into the cover of the trees, rushed forward. He stepped onto the disguised trench, and with a terrible, dry snap of branches, the earth gave way. The mercenary bellowed a sound of pure surprise and pain as he plunged into the trench, dropping his machete and losing his grip on Adesuwa. She stumbled free, tearing the silk from her mouth, her breath catching in ragged gasps. She looked around wildly, and in the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy, she saw Kofi emerge from the shadow of the baobab, his face streaked with dirt, his eyes burning with resolve. Her fear was instantly replaced by a wave of disbelief, then a sudden, crushing realization of the sacrifice she was witnessing. "Kofi," she whispered, her voice a raw, desperate plea. He didn't speak. He simply grabbed her arm and pulled her further into the forest, away from the struggling mercenary in the trench. They ran for their lives, Adesuwa's expensive gown snagging on thorns, Kofi shielding her with his body from the low-hanging branches. She was running with the poor boy, the one she had publicly humiliated, and he was risking everything for her. The irony of the moment was a stunning blow to her pride. She had chosen comfort, and comfort had betrayed her. She had rejected courage, and courage was now her only salvation. The giant was climbing out of the trench, his fury a palpable force. They couldn't outrun him for long. Kofi looked at the girl whose rejection was his deepest scar, and knew the true test of his love was not in winning her affection, but in saving her life, even if he died doing it. Kofi and Adesuwa found a temporary refuge in a small, hidden clearing where the medicinal herbs grew thick and high, creating a natural screen. They huddled together, listening to the heavy footsteps of their pursuer drawing closer. Adesuwa, finally safe for a moment, turned to Kofi. Her beautiful face was no longer haughty, it was a canvas of guilt and gratitude. "Why, Kofi? Why are you here? After everything I said?" Her voice cracked, shame heavy in every syllable. Kofi simply shook his head, looking not at her beauty, but into her frightened soul. "Adesuwa," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "a man's heart is not made of gold, but of his choices. Your rejection was yours to make, but your life is a treasure I cannot stand to see taken by darkness." His words, simple and true, stripped away the years of her pride and her father's prejudice. She realized, for the first time, that she had judged the priceless value of his character by the worthless measure of his material possessions. She reached out and touched his hand, a gesture of connection that meant more than any declaration of love. Just then, the giant mercenary burst into the clearing, his eyes wide with rage, his machete raised high. He had tracked them easily, driven by the sting of being tricked by the poor boy. "So, the little mouse has a dog to protect him," he snarled, advancing on Kofi. Kofi pushed Adesuwa behind him, standing his ground. This was the climax, not of a battle between a soldier and a fisherman, but between courage and cruelty. Kofi had no weapon, but he had the forest. As the giant swung the machete, aiming for a swift, lethal blow, Kofi did not try to dodge. Instead, he dropped low, grabbing a handful of the dried, powdered, highly irritating medicinal herb he knew well, flinging it with all his might into the mercenary's face. The effect was immediate and blinding. The giant screamed, dropping his machete again, clutching his eyes, stumbling around the small clearing in agony. It was the only chance Kofi would get. He grabbed Adesuwa's hand and pulled her out of the clearing, running back toward the village, now free of their most immediate threat. They burst out of the forest just as dawn was breaking, casting long, golden shadows across the village. The chief's men, having regrouped, were cautiously advancing toward the forest. When they saw Adesuwa, unharmed, led by the poor boy, a silence fell over them that was heavier than the night. Kofi, exhausted but triumphant, led Adesuwa to her father, who was huddled near the main gate, pale and distraught. The chief rushed to his daughter, embracing her tightly, then looked up to see her savior, Kofi, the boy he had always ignored. Adesuwa stepped forward, away from her father's grasp, and stood deliberately beside Kofi. "He saved me, Papa. He is the only one who did. Everyone else ran or was defeated. He came back for me." Chief Ekintola, a man whose pride was as vast as his wealth, looked at the mud-streaked, defiant fisherman's son who stood beside his daughter. He saw the genuine, raw courage that eclipsed his own failures. The poor boy had risked his life for the girl who had rejected him, not for a reward, not for a promise, but because it was simply the right thing to do. Kofi's choice had not only saved Adesuwa's life but had stripped the chief of his arrogance and Adesuwa of her prejudice. The greatest wealth, they all finally understood, was not the gold in the vault but the character of the man standing before them. Kofi looked at Adesuwa, and in her eyes, he saw not pity or rejection, but an awakening of true, deep respect. The final silence of the morning was not one of fear, but of profound, emotional reckoning. The poor boy had not won her love, but he had earned her life, and in doing so, he had become the king of his own story. Kofi never became wealthy in the way Chief Ekintela had defined it, but he became a man of profound respect in the village. Adesuwa, having escaped her gilded cage, never married the man of her father's political choosing. 5 years later, she helped Kofi open a community trade school near the river, and she never once regretted her choice. Not because of what came after, but because she chose with her heart. And a heart that chooses love over luxury, character over cash, and purpose over prestige, will never lead you wrong. If this story moved you, hit like, share it, and tell me in the comments, what is the most valuable currency a person can possess, wealth or courage? Subscribe to Stories by the King, where every story carries a heartbeat, and every choice carries a lesson. This is Stories by the King, where love wins, and purpose finds its home.